just very quickly in terms of who we are. So from my side, I'm James Peck, tax partner and head of the tech and high growth team here at Cooper Parry. Today's session is going to really cover some of the kind of the areas that we want to look at as you think about scaling and growing, specifically fundraising in the US. Paul, why don't I kick over to you, because I think the intro kind of covers off the reason why you're on the call as well.
Yeah, cool. Hi, everyone. Great to be here today. So I am former founder and entrepreneur. I've hung up my boots now after 25 years of building companies, and the last 15 of that was basically building tech companies, and all of them I took to the US, and essentially British companies that expanded to the US and raised pretty much every penny of like venture capital I've raised was actually from US VCs at different stages. So that's my background. I currently also work at Bessemer as an operating advisor. So I support their early stage companies on things like go-to-market and general scaling. And I'm an entrepreneur in residence at Episode 1 in the UK, which is a tier 1 seed fund. So I've got a pretty good sort of foot in both camps in terms of Silicon Valley and the London ecosystem.
Perfect. So what we're going to cover today is we're going to touch on the current UK landscape to an extent, and kind of get an idea of like your views on kind of how the UK is currently looking in terms of raising funding in the UK. And then I think the reason why a lot of people have joined today is then kind of get your insights around the US in a bit more detail.
And I forgot one thing. I didn't plug my own fund, which, by the way, is all about helping European companies go to the US, which is crazy. So sorry about that. It's crazy. I'm still maybe a bit hungover from yesterday at Wimbledon. But yes, I also now run a deal by deal fund called In This Together, and we invest along tier 1 funds into European companies that are looking to go and expand into the US. And what makes this quite different is that a majority of our US investors, a majority of our angels and family offices are US based. So we're all about essentially sort of helping, like I say, European companies to go and take on the US.
Fantastic. Right. So should we kick off with a kind of like quick, kind of more open question? So fundamentally, how do you see the current UK, or how do you currently see the UK fundraising landscape?
I think it's pretty good. It's pretty robust. There's a lot of really great funds that have now emerged, I think, in the last sort of 10, 15 years, particularly in the sort of earlier stage. And so I think we're now really well catered for. If you're looking at just UK funds, I think we're now really well catered for. There are a number of tier 1 early stage funds that are very active, that are into now 4th, 5th, 6th funds. So they've gone through multiple cycles. And so I think that sort of pre-seed, seed, Series A, really, really strong, maturing really quite nicely, and I think operating, almost much more like sort of US funds, if you like.
Okay, all right. So that's kind of like that kind of seed to Series A, where and I think we'll get into this a little bit later on, but kind of key observations around. And this kind of came out of the conversation with Barney from Clio. Some of the challenges that businesses face when they start looking beyond that. So look beyond Series B, Series C, Series D. I think maybe what we'll do is we'll park that for the time being, but that seems to be a kind of almost a pain point for businesses as they grow and scale. And if they really want to then kind of really kind of have that next phase of growth, the US is then going to have to be a kind of area where they look. And I guess interesting point, maybe one that maybe we reflect on at the moment, which is, why is it? What's stopping the kind of capital injection by UK investors at the moment from flowing? And why is it, what's the reason for that? Why is there not the accessibility to funds in the UK as it stands at the moment?
Yeah, I think like everyone gets a bit frustrated, right, with the UK stroke European ecosystem. Why haven't we created more unicorns? Why haven't we created $1 trillion company? There was a really interesting, in last year's State of the Union report by Tomaco. They basically somehow worked out the total value of the European ecosystem, right? And they added up basically the valuation of all private tech companies and all public tech companies in the whole of Europe. And it came to about $3.5 trillion, which sounds like a big number until you remember that's like Nvidia is actually worth more than that now. I think it's almost at 4 trillion. So they have like one single company is bigger than the entire ecosystem in Europe, both private and public. And it's really frustrating, and it's annoying for us in Europe, and you sort of scratch your head and think about why. And I'm just going to do a very, very, very quick history lesson here. And I just quickly checked earlier on just so I get my facts exactly right. But what I do say to people is you've got to realize that the venture capital ecosystem began really in Silicon Valley in the late 50s, early 60s, right? And even back then, it was kind of like a cottage industry until there was this huge change in how there was a massive pension unlock, right? And it happened in 1979 when pensions were essentially allowed to invest in private equity and venture capital, right, and debt. And that was the massive unlock. And there was, I think it's Don Valentine. He was one of the co-founders of Sequoia. He's quoted as saying, everything changed when that pension money basically hit in 1979. There was one more thing that happened in the early 80s, actually, driven by Reagan, which is share options and the way they were treated in terms of tax. And up until early 80s, it was like 50% tax on share options, right? For when you realize them. And he brought them right down to 20%. And there are quotes saying like that's essentially like the talent honeypot, or that was the sort of the honey that attracted the talent bees to Silicon Valley. So those two things, there was a little bit of innovation around what was going on in the Cold War, but the two main drivers of Silicon Valley was the pensions and the tax treatment of share options. And but that's been going on since the mid 60s. Now, the first time I tried to raise money myself in 2011 in London, absolutely impossible. There was nothing here. There was literally some of the early stage funds that we're very familiar with now were just maybe starting to start raising a fund. They maybe have done some angel investing and they were now turning themselves into like actual funds. Excel was here. Index was pretty active. They were a Swiss fund, European fund, but obviously now, pretty big in America. But there was nothing. And I remember going to pitches and people would be saying, as a seed company, like, so we're like, oh, we don't really invest in anything unless it's EBITDA positive. I'll be like, well, I'm 6 months old. What do you mean, like EBITDA? Am I stupid? Have I got this completely wrong? But it was literally,
Did you have revenues at that point?
I think we had some revenues in that company, but certainly nothing like, so obviously like years away from EBITDA positive.
Yeah.
But that was what it was like. And so we actually had to, in Ceros, my first company, we actually raised from Greycroft in America, in New York, and then we had to move there. And that's basically what happened. But that's why it's fundamentally for me, it's about ecosystem maturity. Like it's taking a while. Like I said, now in the UK, we're really well served by some very, very high quality tier one, seed and Series A funds. And now we're starting to see some of those funds like Atomico, like Balderson, raise much bigger later stage funds. And I think forward 10, 15 years, and we will probably have a really nice, rich end-to-end ecosystem where you can raise, very, very large rounds here in the UK and Europe.
I guess so. If we say those 2 points, which is unlocking the pension funds in order to disperse capital down into the VCs, is huge, and that's obviously something that hasn't happened in the UK yet. Interestingly, that point also raised for last week when we discussed it as well. But we already do have beneficial share option schemes available, so at least we've cracked that nut. So
almost better than the US in some ways, in terms of some of the ways that we treat share options.
Well, yeah, I guess. Well, currently, yes. That may change though if Rachel Reeves has a way around capital gains tax and what that alignment needs to look like. My personal.
but you're not forced. There are ways in the UK where you're not forced to exercise your options if you leave a company. In the US, you have to make an investment decision quite typically.
Yeah.
So like there are certain other nuances where actually I think I saw once, I think it might be Index put it out or something, but a league table of like countries and share options and which was the best, and the UK was actually ahead of the US in that league table.
It's got capital gains tax treatment. So at the moment you've got 24%. You've also got this entrepreneurs or business asset disposal relief that will bring it down to like 14%.
Yeah.
Although that is increasing. Like if we look at that, yes, it is more beneficial than the US at the moment. Bizarrely, there are also countries that you would expect to have beneficial tax treatment on share options, which frankly have never considered it. Like the one that always blows my mind is Germany. Germany doesn't have a kind of beneficial share option plan scheme at the moment. So what everyone does in Germany is they put in these phantom share schemes, which are basically akin to a bonus for pegs against market performance of the business. It's bizarre. Like, I don't know why they haven't considered it. So in that regard, at least we've cracked one nut, although the inference is that the government may be increasing CGT in the future. But I think for us, it's about the disbursement of funds and really, actually allowing the pensions to release that the additional capital. And that will take us, what you're saying is absolutely right. We've got great disbursement of funds from seed up to like Series A, Series B. But if we really want to think about growing these businesses beyond that point and actually retain them here in the UK, then actually there has to be the accessibility of the funds in order to do so. Otherwise, we will get onto this. Otherwise, people are going to have to look to the US in order to raise the funding. Or alternatively, and this is the issue that I've seen in the past, is that UK businesses just get to a ceiling, and that's where they kind of then go, well, actually, we probably can't grow without taking on funding. And the founders probably go, well, look, we may as well kind of just call it a day and sell out at that point, and we're getting to a certain.
I'm definitely seeing a big shift, and I've been pretty active in the ecosystem since like 2010. I've seen a massive shift in founder ambition. That's definitely changed. You're right. A lot of companies maybe hit a decent scale and then basically sell. Often to a US company. But the founder ambition has completely changed. I mean, I also coach CEOs. And within my coaching pool, and some of them are going for, one of them in particular, I won't name any names, and it's definitely not a name and shame. I think it's brilliant, but one of them is absolutely convinced that he can create a $1 trillion business. And so I'm like this, and actually some of the fundamentals of that business, yes, you could, yes, actually they could, not just him. But that ambition has definitely changed. The other thing that has massively changed in the last like 10 years, and it's definitely very important to call out and obviously very relevant to this conversation, is that there were no US VCs in London in 2010, like just none. And well, I say that Excel were actually here, but that was it. Now there's actually 60 US funds that are operating in London with a partner, and of those, there's a list of tier one funds, and so I'm just going to read them out. So the tier one US funds that have got at least one partner here are Excel, Bessemer, General Catalyst, Insight, Google Ventures, Lightspeed, NEA, and Sequoia. Now they just weren't here before, and so what's really interesting, and this has created some really interesting dynamics, because those early stage seed funds, and those funds are basically massive multi-stage funds, right? So what you've now got is you've got these early stage seed funds in London that are now operating in a sort of US way, deploying capital in a US way, thinking about markets in a sort of US way, perhaps, and now competing with multi-stage like funds. So like an early stage fund in London might suddenly be competing with Sequoia. It's like, what? That doesn't seem fair. So that's happening. But then at the other end of the spectrum, they're also filling that gap, right? So they're now doing those later stage deals, but you can go and do a later stage deal with Sequoia in London if you want. Obviously, you have to be a pretty good company to go and do that, or GC. So that's kind of interesting too. So I wonder what that's going to do to the sort of dynamics of the market. But yeah, they've almost sort of filled that gap, and so. The playbook to raise from a US VC used to be you get your seed to get your MVP, you get some great traction. You raise your A to then continue that traction in the UK and get some US traction, because you couldn't raise from a US VC unless you had a strong US story. And then you raise your Series B in America, and off you go. That used to be the sort of playbook to raising from a US venture capital firm. Now the playbook's completely different. You can actually, these funds that are in London, in Europe, are looking at with a European lens. They're still looking for massive outlier winners, but they're now looking at a European lens. You don't need to have that US traction to raise from those funds that are in London. You do still, though, for the funds that aren't in the UK or Europe. That hasn't changed.
So I guess that's the biggest change over the last, say, 10 years, which is two things probably then. The maturing of UK VCs to an extent, the kind of import of US VCs as well. But again, that's probably still quite early stage in terms of like where they're thinking in and around that, as they're still testing the markets a little bit. So I guess you're right. When you're looking at that kind of graph of how far advanced the US are to the UK, we've still got a fair way to go, and there needs to be some government changes as well to disperse funds in a different way. So actually, that's a slightly more positive spin than possibly the conversation that we had last week, which was all about the UK is basically a saturated market, and we're going to have to almost move out of that, and the US has to be the key to grow.
Yeah, I still think there's a lot there. I mean, look, just from forgetting fundraising, just the market is just massive, right? And it's it's the whole, it's a single language. It's much easier to do business across the whole of America than it is to do business across the whole of Europe. I mean, you already mentioned some of the differences just in Germany. I think Belgium's got like an absolutely crazy wonky way of doing tax around share options, but it's not really a sort of single market. The other important point here, we talk about late stage funding, but then the IPO markets are definitely the other part of the story. Because in America you've got the entire end-to-end like sewn up. You've got these highly specialized early stage funds that are maybe their 12th fund. You've got these massive multi-stage funds that are just trying to get loads of bets with really amazing founders to try and then get into the Series A and then hopefully get their big wins. They then do all of the late stage funding, and then you've got some amazing, public stock markets that you can then go public on. So you've got the whole end to end, and the capital markets are very, very mature, and there's real depth. That's the other huge problem that Europe has got, is it's just not end to end. And I've heard people talk about a European market, stock market, which sounds in principle like a really good idea, but it's just, can we pull that off? It's probably very, very tricky. So there's probably that piece to sort of fix as well. I'm not really much of an expert at that end of the spectrum in terms of the public markets, but that's definitely part of the conversation.
Yeah, no, I can see the avenue that you'd go down, but still, that would be a far extension to actually dispersing, solid Series C, D, and E into the UK. Right, it would give another option to what could potentially happen. Okay, cool. Let's get into the US bit a little bit more, because I think and it was good to kind of explore the UK, not only in terms of where we are currently, but also thanks for the history lesson, like a little bit of history as to like where we got to, and I didn't realize.
Yeah, I just don't think we should beat ourselves up too much, right? Because we're a much, much less mature ecosystem. That's basically it.
Yeah, and I guess in order for us to, like, there's a point here where we've got it's one of those things where you've got this kind of almost paradox where you've got UK tech companies that are growing rapidly at speed, and it's just that frustration that sits there, because obviously the funding element of it isn't scaling as quickly. It's scaling, don't get me wrong, it's changing and evolving,
but then, like I say, compared to 2010, I couldn't even raise in London. Right now, you can. It's brilliant. Like, so I'm comparing it to what it was like in the real dark ages. And so, honestly, from if you think about it from that lens, we've never had it as good.
No, true. That sounds good. Right. What are the key differences between raising in the UK versus in the US?
So I think so. Good question. And I think that this comes down to basic sort of fund economics, right? And this is what a lot of founders maybe still don't quite wrap their heads around, and they get frustrated and all this kind of stuff. But, basically, if you have $1 billion fund, right, and you think that a good return to investors if you is 4x, right, on your fund size. Okay, so you make $1 billion, you deploy $1 billion, and you get 4 billion back, right? That would be seen as an incredibly, a great achievement, right? And very few funds, I think, actually even achieve that. Even some of these big Silicon Valley funds struggle to even achieve that. But then, actually, how do you do that? Well, let's say just to keep the math simple, like your exit percentage is 10%. And by the way, what we're not talking about is the valuation of your portfolio. You have to exit these companies, turn it into cash, and then literally wire it back to your LPs. And if you have 10% on average exit value, right? Then and you have a company that you invest in that exits at $5 billion, and you think, wow, that's got to be a return. That's got to be an amazing outcome for that fund. Nope, not really, because 10% of 5 billion is 500 million. And if you've got $1 billion fund, you need to get to 4 to be seen as like really, really good. So you're kind of you're not even back to returning the capital to LPs, right? You're not even getting to 1x what's called DPI. So and that's a $1 billion fund. I think Andreessen's last fund was like 7, and that's maybe a bit misleading because that's across different types of funds. And again, the economics change if you're a very late stage investor versus if you're a very early stage investor. But some of these early stage funds in America are massive, multiple billions, and so they can't just like invest in a company that they think is going to return $1 billion or $2 billion. Like if you go to one of those Silicon Valley funds and say, oh, I think we can grow this to become worth 2 or 3 billion, they'll be like, not big enough, mate. Sorry. Well, they won't say like that. They won't sound English, but they'll just say no. Because they need to have confidence to make the fund work. That really you could get to probably a $10 billion outcome, and they need to have real confidence to underwrite your investment, essentially. And so the big difference is they're forced to only find these outliers. And if you're not an outlier, then they're just not going to invest, which is frustrating, because if you're thinking, I think I can create a company worth $1 billion, and that's not enough, it's like, well, it's great, and if you can do that, then absolutely fantastic. But that's not enough for them, just purely because of the fund size. So I think that's why a lot of founders get a bit confused about this. And so you've really got to remember that, and remember there's a lot of funds in the UK that aren't that big, right? So they're not having to think about that. So that's actually a benefit, I think, of this ecosystem. But certainly, if you're then going to do later stage financing in America, you have to be able to tell a very big story of category domination if you're going to raise from a major Silicon Valley firm.
So, sorry, just to cut through that, are we saying that the return at a UK VC versus a US VC is substantially lower?
Just because of fund size, yeah. If you got a lower fund size, you don't need like I said, for certain funds of a certain size, a $5 billion exit that you own 10% of could be extraordinary. Yeah, if you have a $100 million fund, that's it. You've 5x'd it off one investment. That's your fund returner. That's what I mean. That's how the economics work. So they're not. So they would see you with an outcome of $1 billion or 2 billion potential as okay, worth a bet.
Yeah, got you. But it is a portfolio play for them as well. Like it shouldn't just be resting on 1 or 2, investments. It's hopefully investing in enough that are going to turn into something. But they're after the big ticket items, is what we're saying.
Well, it's the power law of venture capital, right? It's like 1 or 2 probably return most of the fund, and that's it. And everyone knows it's power law. But to give your pal the best chance possible, you've got to the investor committee's got to say we think this could all being very well from a business model and from a market perspective and a team perspective. I could see this becoming a $10 billion company.
Okay, all right. I'm going to ask a question then, which is going to skip ahead a little bit just on this front. So it must be challenging then for the UK founders who've historically worked with UK VCs to then go to the US and have it's almost like a completely different mindset. You said it before about this level of ambition, the level of risk, and all those other things. What are the key differences that UK founders or CFOs need to consider when they're initially starting to talk to US VCs? And is there a different mindset that needs to be applied in that regard?
I think apart from what I've just said, right, you need to be able to articulate, a big category defining story. That's really it. That's the main thing. And have you got the team to do it? Do your metrics support it? And like I say, if you're raising in from a US fund that is not in Europe, you have to have a strong US story. You really do. And they're not going to just. They're not just going to. I mean, I've heard stories even recently where companies go through the whole pain of flipping to a Delaware topco just to try and raise from a US VC with no US traction. It's just like I think they're going to see. I think they're going to see there's no US traction still. It doesn't matter that you're suddenly a US topco, but you're all based in London. That's crazy. I've literally had stories of that trying to happen. So yeah, you still need that US story if you're raising from a US VC. The other thing I should also say, and this is part of why our US angels and family offices are keen to invest in European tech, is that it's cheaper here, right? Like literally valuations are essentially half at seed. So there is a real arbitrage for those investors who are investing in tier one, companies in Europe and London, who then go on to raise in the US. When they do make that raise, that sort of true up happens, and that's where they get their sort of arbitrage. But deals in Europe are much cheaper for many of the reasons that we've already outlined.
Okay, got it. So there's a huge learning there for anyone looking to raise funding, and the US being the kind of the new entry point, both in terms of the expectations of the VCs and how they've fundamentally approached UK VCs in the past. Like, you don't go to them saying, I'm going to be £1 billion business, because, or not necessarily, is that all of them, or is that just the big,
probably the big ones. Again, it's understanding. When you're raising capital, it's a bit like when you're thinking about go to market, right? And you think about ICP. Have you heard of ICP? The acronym is Ideal Customer Profile. And the foundations or the fundamentals of very good go to market is going really narrow and really understanding your ICP. And the same principles apply for raising capital. Like you need to understand who your ICP VC is, basically. Ideal customer profile, IVP, your ideal venture profile. Anyway, whatever. And understanding the size of the fund is one of those metrics that you got to really think about. Union Square Ventures, for example, obviously based in New York. Fred Wilson, he's just incredible, probably one of the most successful VCs like in history. Their fund, I don't think, was ever bigger than 150 to 200 million. And they had extraordinary wins. But they deliberately kept their fund down because they didn't want to have to try and chase these $10 billion exits. It just so happened they actually, ironically, did have plenty of $10 billion plus exits. And that's why their fund is probably, from a returns perspective, up there in history as some of the best funds, in venture capital.
One of the things that you mentioned on LinkedIn as well, and I was intrigued to pick your brain on this, is that not only do we talk about like the difference between fundraising in the UK versus the US, but you then flagged also the difference between East and West Coast.
And that this is a true thing. Generally speaking, and I imagine over time this is kind of like leveling out, but in terms of like risk taking I guess sort of risk taking and sort of conservativeness. You've got London, which is becoming more American in its kind of outlook, I guess. Then you hit the sort of East Coast, and there's still a degree of like capital efficiency is really, really important and all those kinds of things, and a degree of conservatism. And then when you hit the West Coast, that they're much more like, dream big, think global, go swing for the fences and create a $100 billion company. And so they'll back vision a little bit more there, and founders. And like I say, then it's sort of the flavor of it kind of like gets a bit more conservative as you travel across America, East Coast, and then probably hit London, and then probably go into Europe. It's even more conservative.
Yeah. Let me pick on a different point, which is so I thought it was amusing that you've got a UK business that just inserts a US topco and thinks it's going to raise funding. Obviously, it's down to what the business is doing, the key metrics of the business, and those things. Do you think it's important? And obviously you've been through this. Do you think it's important for founders to move to the US, really as part of their kind of strategic growth into the US market and to raise funding? Does the founder need to be there for that? Can they still do it from the UK?
This is a very interesting topic, and there's no sort of one size fits all. I mean, that is again another, and there's so many different nuances. There's also like the other thing that's changed a lot is the terms, in terms of raising capital, like safes weren't really a thing, and now everybody uses safes, and so which has definitely sped things up, right? Because it's a very, very quick mechanism to raise capital. I think it was Y Combinator that started that, but again, in the old days, when I used to build companies, you had to go there. Like if you're raising US money, you had to go. You had to go raise there, and you had to move there. That's what I had to do. I lived in New York for 2 years because we raised money from Greycroft, and we had to move. That was the expectation. Otherwise, they wouldn't have invested. Obviously, COVID was a big accelerator that you can actually raise money on Zoom, right? And it was completely unheard of that you do that until COVID, and that changed a lot. And now I think people are, you can build companies in theory. And what's really fascinating is obviously what's happening in AI, not just in terms of a product perspective, but what you can do operationally as a company as well. The game is changing. The game is changing a little bit. But I do think if you're a sort of a mid-market or enterprise company and you want category dominance in the US, you got to go. You just got to go as a founder. Forget the fundraising part of the story. You have to be out there to meet your customers and realize and just soak up the environment of being in America, and it's just absolutely critical. And out there, particularly, actually, prospects, customers, they want to meet the CEO, and so I think if to oversimplify your answer, I'd say, why are you going there? If you're going there for category dominance, and you're probably a mid-market or enterprise play, you have to go there as a CEO. There's just you really do.
I think there's also that dilution. If the founder's not going to go across and he's going to then subcontract or delegate that to someone else, that dilution doesn't necessarily always work, especially when there's the messaging and where the business wants to go and all those things. You're right. I guess if you really want to land the US, where I've seen it land very successfully, and it may not be a permanent thing, is where that founder does go and spend time there, as you said, talking to the customers, building a team,
building a network, you're personally as well. And it's also speed of execution. I mean, right now, speed is one of the most important, one of the most important factors in success. And I'm actually really glad I'm no longer a founder, because I feel real sympathy right now, because AI is making everyone breathless, right? It's like, wow, it's changing everything so quickly. Everything's so much faster, and you have to keep up, or you might fall very quickly behind. And so speed of just execution is key. And if your US team can only access you as a CEO, like let's say your team's like you're on the West Coast, you've got 4 hours with the CEO a day. That's it. For the rest of the whole of that day of executing, you're kind of stuck, because you can't run things past the CEO, right? So you lose that. And I often sort of sometimes use cricket as an example here. I do love cricket. And quite often you hear the commentators or the captains of old cricket teams saying, what should England do? Or what should the England team do right now? What the English team should do right now is exactly what the captain of the opposing team does not want them to do. So it might be like sticking them in for 20 overs before close and going at them really, really hard in terms of the bowlers against their batsmen. They wouldn't want to do that. So do that, right? So what would the US CEO do what would the US CEO prefer the UK CEO does that they're competing with? Stay in bloody London. That's exactly what they would like them to do because of all the disadvantages. And I can tell you honestly, from direct experience, you wake up here and all you get hit with is like the stuff that's local and all the local, problems and issues and noise. And you're not thinking about the US because you're not being hit by that as much. It's kind of coming at you via Slack, maybe, or the odd Zoom call with some of your execs over there or senior people over there. That's not good. That's not good. You need to be in the environment, waking up, watching US news, being submerged in US culture, reminded every second of every day the scale of the place, and executing super fast.
Cool. I'm going to bring us back onto the fundraising point again. But that was an interesting kind of side topic. We touched on, or one of the questions I was going to ask you was around pitch decks and adapting a pitch deck for a US VC as opposed to a UK VC. Do you see there being kind of key differences there?
No, I don't actually. I think not really. I mean, a good pitch deck has got 12 to 15 really key slides. I don't think there's much of a difference. I really don't. I think again, I think the sort of for the sort of tier one funds in the UK, it is very American now. Like they're backing founders with large checks with not even an MVP. I mean that wouldn't have happened 5 years ago probably, but now people are being backed with millions and millions without even a product, just because of the quality of the team. So I think the approach is definitely now quite similar in both countries, and you need the fundamentals of the deck to be the same in both places. I go back to my earlier point. If you're talking to a massive fund, you've got to be able to tell a big outcome story.
Yeah, got you. So maybe I would present the question slightly differently, as opposed to tailoring the pitch deck differently. In order to engage US VCs differently, I take your point about presenting yourself as a multi-billion pound business. Is there anything else that you need to think about before you even get in the room with the VCs to position yourself slightly differently than you would have done with the UK VC?
Well, I think, like I say, I honestly think that it's become quite similar. If I was pitching to a tier one, I'll pick I won't choose episode one because I see the pitches that happen there and I see the pitch decks. But let's say a local globe, the pitch would be the same if I was pitching to local globe for a $5 million seed round as it would be if I was pitching to Sequoia for a $5 million. Like, but it's the same. It's the same. Like they're looking for outliers. They're looking for outliers, and so you have to be able to project that you've got that ambition and that drive and the potential to be that iconic founder as well, right? And so I think it's now. I don't think there's that much difference anymore. And as I said to you, the ambition of the European founder has dramatically changed. Now we're not embarrassed by saying we're going to go and create a category defining company. It would be almost, I remember it. It was kind of like, it was like you'd be like, you said that, like, oh my God, really? It's a bit embarrassing. But now it's like they I think founders are being much more confident and ambitious, and that's to be applauded.
Founders in the UK or founders in the US or both?
Founders in the UK, yeah. I mean, founders in the US have always been like that. But again, I think this also comes back to the ecosystem maturity, right? We've got to remember that they were creating these massive companies in this, in the 80s, 90s, and so I think it's part of that. And I think that the vision and the ambition of the ecosystem is dramatically changed now.
Yeah, I think it's also helped by also more UK founders kind of going to the US as well, spending time around other people like at YC and things like that, and hearing them talk in that regard. Like
All
it
of
does
that.
off on people, and they're like, "Well, hang on, you know,
Well,
before I went, I might have wanted to create, a billion-pound business, and then I'm going there, and suddenly everyone's talking about trillion-dollar businesses. Like, whoa, that's a whole
yeah.
different fish."
Yeah, and look, we're in the main, we're all listening to the same content now, right? We're all listening to the podcasts from the US, and the Andreessen. I listen to the Mark Andreessen on various different podcasts. I think one of the Altman brothers is now doing lots and lots of podcasts and interviews with these great people, and that's what we're all consuming that now, basically. So it's kind of homogenizing, I guess, in a way.
Good stuff. Just to mention that no one's put anything in the chat bar at the moment, either in the Q&A, or I think we've got the webinar chat open as well. So if anyone does have any questions, do feel free to pop those in there, and we'll take it from there. Okay, let me ask you a slightly different question, which is there a difference and distinction by having a US VC on the board to a UK VC? Do they act in different ways? Do they have different criteria? Is it more challenging to have a US VC on the board?
Well, look, the London or the UK VC ecosystem has got like many flavors, right? There is a segment of UK VC which is very kind of like now US kind of in its flavor. Growth is critical, and ambition and scale and blah blah blah. But there's still a very big segment of the UK investors that are much more cautious, very different. Their outcome expectations are dramatically different. So you absolutely can get a complete clash of cultures, within your VCs, for sure. So I think you have to think carefully about that. If you raise from I don't want to be too rude sounding, but like an old-fashioned, old school, overly cautious VC, there's still plenty. And personal view, and again, I won't name any, but there are some really shit VCs in London that have really weird, well, UK. They charge fees. It's a bit puke. It's a bit old fashioned. If you raise from them, you've got potential signaling risk. It's real. As you then go and raise, later rounds.
Right.
But if you're a breakout company and you've got one of those quite shitty VCs on your cap table, and you're a breakout company and you are doing great and your metrics are great, and you do then raise from a tier one VC, almost inevitably there's going to be a bit of a culture clash for sure, and that's always difficult. But you can sometimes just get your early VCs just off the board as you grow. I mean that's a very natural part of the evolution of your board of directors for sure.
Yeah. Okay, that's really helpful. Really helpful. Another question, which is slightly different, which is there have been quite a few debates recently about concerns around potentially some of the founders or the founder community getting kind of a little bit concerned around, increases in tax rates in the UK, and then concerns around founders exiting the UK, which might then have a drain on resource. Like, what are your views on that?
By exiting the UK, you mean what? Like just like moving?
Like, yeah, basically leaving the UK. So the concern is that a lot of founders, let's say that they are holding whatever percentage in their business at the moment, they come into a liquidity event and then they go, right, that's it. I'm going to basically pack up shop and I'm going to move to a low tax jurisdiction. That might be Florida, that might be UAE. Is this a real concern for us at the moment, or do we think that we can kind of dodge that bullet and kind of move around it? Is it a concern that founders have at the moment?
Is it a concern for the UK ecosystem or concern for founders or
UK ecosystem?
All of it.
And therefore
UK ecosystem.
Leading to a lack of potential entrepreneurship in the UK.
Yeah, I mean it's not that's not ideal, because one of the great Well, one of the great advantages that we have, I mean, even Sequoia put this out quite recently, is that I think from an actual numbers perspective, we've got more people, like we've got more people in Europe that are expert in AI than America, right? That's in absolute terms. That's another reason why I think our ecosystem is really great and strong. We have brilliant talent. Um, and I do know it's very real, right? That founders that are looking at a big exit, they'll be planning where to leave, because if your exit's happening, imminently, you can just go and one place you can go is the Isle of Man, which is I've never actually been there. It looks kind of like a pretty quirky place, but you just go to the Isle of Man, and then the transaction happens the next day, and that's it. The government can't tax you. They can't tax your capital gains. I mean, obviously you've got to be out the country, and don't know what the rules are and for how long, but that's not
Yeah.
great. You don't. And I know for sure, because I've witnessed it just even recently of friends of mine or founders or whatever about to have big outcomes. They're thinking about where to go and live for a bit. That's not great.
I guess that's the concern, which is if, back to that point we had right at the beginning, which is, we're still trying to catch up in terms of where the funding is from a US perspective. We have all these advantages from a tax perspective with share options at the moment, but we could end up in a position where if the government are not going to listen and they're going to continue to hike up capital gains tax, then actually we might end up with this pool of like entrepreneurship leaving the UK. And at that point, you're like,
Yeah.
well, we then have the funds, but we don't have the kind of the entrepreneurs. And
But
what
we may have an insane talent density on the Isle of Man.
you mentioned this yesterday. No one's moving to the Isle of Man. Like there's like three. There's not enough going on the island.
No, I know, but I have heard of people who literally go there, and then I think if you bugger off to avoid capital gains, like you can stay in the UK for like 90, like you can stay overnight for like 90 times or whatever, or 90 nights if you want to call it. But I've heard of stories where people literally go to the Isle of Man because it's quite near, and helicopter in for the day and helicopter back
Well, I
to
guess
avoid that.
if you've saved a fortune by not paying tax, then a helicopter ride
Yeah,
won't be that bad. You can also make yourself like a tax nomad as well, where you can kind of disperse yourself around the globe. Actually,
yeah,
there was always an interesting story where someone created a yacht for exactly that purpose, or like a sea liner for that purpose. So you were actually effectively never tax resident anywhere because you were constantly moving. And that gave you the ability
wow,
to kind of travel around the world, make sure that you were not tax resident anywhere, and then dip
yeah.
into places.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, look, I'm no expert on this. I mean, look, there's a kind of a moral and ethical conversation to be had around that as well, I guess. But yeah, like we don't want to create a talent, exodus. That would not be good. I don't know how real it is. I'm not sure, but there are obviously many great benefits to living in this country as well. I mean, overall, it's a brilliant country to be in. We've got a very great safety net. In America, there is no safety net. It's pretty rough. Not really. And I think it just got worse with the BBB, as far as I understand it. The big beautiful bill.
yeah.
Taking more Medicaid away from people and all that kind of stuff. Not that I follow that very closely. So it is I think a great country to be in. And if you've benefited from being in this country, then pay tax. But again, then I guess the other end of the argument is if you're building a company very successfully here, you're paying an absolute shit ton of tax anyway. So I don't know. I'm not really an expert in this area. I mean, obviously you'll know much more than I do. But yes, talent exodus would not be great.
No, it wouldn't be great. It wouldn't be great. Thank you so much. I think what we've had there is a strong canter through not only the kind of current landscape in terms of the UK, a little bit of a retrospective look back over the UK funding scene over the last few years, which is super informative. And hopefully, if we can kind of look at it in the lens of what the US have been able to do as well, then that may lead to a future direction as long as, and this is a big flag, but as long as the government are willing to listen and understand the ambitions and growth of the UK businesses. So in my head, I'm like, the government need to get on board in terms of like actually disbursement of funds, but also make sure that we don't go on to that last point, that kind of exodus of individuals leaving the UK, because You know, that could lead to, as you said, we could just basically become a kind of accelerator fund for the US in many ways, get companies up from C to Series A to Series B, and the trodden path then is that will continue, and actually they'll all just sell out at that point to US businesses. So
yeah, but then you can also, yeah, but you can IPO as a UK headquartered company, right? As well. Not that many have actually done it. I think the bigger thing is getting that public market piece right, and that's tough. That's really tough, because that's the bit that you sort of, then a lot of that value then economically goes to the US is when the company actually goes public, and then those US investors basically benefit massively. And that doesn't, you don't have to be a US company to do that. You can be a British headquartered company, and you just go, you know, probably like a Revolut, probably go, well, I could be worth I could be worth 100 billion here or 200 billion there. I think I'll go there. It's like, what are you going to do? But it's probably that bit. And then when you go, I'll probably go over there, then all of that economic value creation in the public markets, then that happens over there. And I think that's probably the bigger problem.
Yeah, that's good. All right. Thank you so much. Thanks everyone for joining today. And we'll catch up on the next session. Thanks everyone.
Bye.